Let us commence our module by studying the concept of aggregate supply curve. An economy is in equilibrium when the quantity of goods produced in the economy is equals to the demand for these goods. In other words, in output price or output inflation space, when aggregate demand curve intersects aggregate supply curve, we get equilibrium level of output produced or equilibrium level of income and spending and the equilibrium price level. In the previous two modules, we have studied the concept of aggregate demand. In this module, we will explain the concept of aggregate supply curve.
After studying this module, you shall be able to know the concept of aggregate supply curve, identify the aggregate supply curve in the classical and Keynesian cases, derive the aggregate supply function graphically, derive the mathematical equation of aggregate supply curve, understand the slope and position of aggregate supply curve, study the factors that lead to supply shocks.
Let us start discussing the definition of aggregate supply curve. With the objective of profit maximization, the amount of output that the firms are willing to supply at the given price level in the economy constitute the aggregate supply. The aggregate supply curve describes for each given price level the quantity of output firms are willing to supply according to Dornbusch and Fisher 1994, page number 200. The amount of output that the firms are willing to supply depends on two things. First, the prices that they receive for their output, and second, the cost of factors of production. The cost of factors of production in turn depends on first, level of inputs available, second, the level of technology available. Thus, aggregate supply reflects the condition that prevails in the factor markets. Assuming that there are two main factors of production, labor and capital, aggregate supply curve will reflect the equilibrium in the labor market and the capital market. Labor is supplied by the households at the ongoing wage rate in the economy. Labor supply is affected by the population growth in the economy. Capital is supplied by the firm. An increase in investment by firms in machineries, building, equipments and materials increases the supply of capital stock in the economy. Thus, cost of labor input is the wage rate, while the cost of capital inputs is the interest rates and the returns to investment versus savings. Construction of aggregate supply curve is different from the construction of the simple supply curve of a firm that is studied in microeconomics. At an individual firm level, an increase in the price level is not associated with the increase in the cost of factors of production. Hence, the firms are willing to supply more at higher prices, leading to an upward sloping supply curve. At the aggregate level, an increase in the price means an increase in the general price level in the economy, which also increases the price of the factors of production. As a result, the cost of production to the firm also increases. In such a situation, firms may not find it worth their while to increase their production. Thus, aggregate supply may not increase with the increase in the price level. There is uncertainty on what will be the shape of the aggregate supply curve. The two main solutions that are provided for this uncertainty in the construction of aggregate supply comes from the classical schools of thought and from the Keynesian school of thought respectively. The shape of aggregate supply curve and its slope differs in terms of which school of thought we are studying. In the next section, we will study the aggregate supply curve in these two schools of thoughts.
Moving on to the aggregate supply curve in the classical approach and in the Keynesian approach, classical economists assume that the aggregate supply curve is vertical, indicating that at the economy-wide level, the same amount of goods are supplied irrespective of the price level. Keynesian economists, on the other hand, assume that the aggregate supply curve is horizontal, indicating that the firms are willing to supply whatever amount of goods at the existing price level. Thus, classical and Keynesian views are completely opposite to each other in terms of aggregate supply. To understand why the aggregate supply curve is different in classical and Keynesian approaches, we need to understand the time framework within which these aggregate supply curves are constructed. Basically, there are two time periods, giving rise to two aggregate supply curves. First, short-run analysis giving rise to short-run aggregate supply curve known as SRAS, and second is the long-run analysis giving rise to the long-run aggregate supply curve known as LRAS.
Next, we will discuss the short-run aggregate supply curve or SRAS or the Keynesian aggregate supply curve. J.M. Keynes held the view that in the short run, economy is operating below the full employment level. In other words, in the short run, factors of production, especially labor, are not employed to their full capacity and there is unemployment. Thus, when the price level changes, say it rises due to a rise in the aggregate demand, firms can increase their production and hence supply by hiring this unemployed labor force without raising the wage rates. Thus, firms can get more labor at the current wage rate and can increase its production with the same average cost of production. When the average cost of production does not change with the level of output, firms are willing to supply as much output as is demanded in the economy at the given price level.
Thus, aggregate supply curve is horizontal. The slope of aggregate supply curve approaches infinity, that is, output is highly responsive to the change in the price level. In a nutshell, in the short run, due to underemployment and wage price rigidity, output will be determined by the aggregate demand. In figure, AS curve is horizontal and AD is as usual downward sloping. Equilibrium is at point E naught, equilibrium price level is P naught and output is Y naught. If aggregate demand increases to AD1, price level has to go up to P1. But due to the wage price rigidity, firms will hire more labor at the going wage rate and produce and supply more output. New equilibrium will be attained at point E1 where output has increased to Y1 without any change in the price level. Thus, price level is fixed and output is determined by AD curve.
Next, we will discuss the long-run aggregate supply curve, which is also known as LRAS or the classical aggregate supply curve. Extremely opposite to Keynes' view, classical economists held the view that economy always operates at full employment level and any deviation from this level will be adjusted through the immediate changes in the price level and the wage rates. Thus, if there are any changes in the price level, say a rise in the price level due to an increase in the demand, firms cannot increase their production. In the labor market, there is no extra labor to be employed to produce extra output to meet the increased demand. Thus, nominal wages will rise in proportion to the price level, bringing the real wages back to their original level which prevailed before the change in the price level. Thus, real variables, real wages and output will remain at their original levels. Only nominal variables, nominal wages and price level will rise. Due to this dichotomy between real and nominal variables, aggregate supply curve under the classical approach is vertical, indicating the same amount of goods to be supplied at any price level. The slope of AS curve is 0, that is, output supplied is unresponsive to any changes in the price level. In a nutshell, in the long run, due to full employment and wage price flexibility, output will be determined by the aggregate supply.
In figure, AS curve is vertical and AD is as usual downward sloping. Equilibrium is at point E naught, equilibrium price level is P naught and output is Y star. If aggregate demand increases to AD1, price level goes up to P1 without any change in the output level. Output cannot be increased beyond Y star. New equilibrium will be attained at point E1, where price has increased to P1 without any change in the output level. Thus, output is fixed by AS curve and price level is determined by the AD curve.
Moving on to the intermediate case, that is the medium run aggregate supply curve known as MRAS. Due to the differences in the two opposing explanations of the shape of the aggregate supply curve, economists have come up with an intermediate case between these extreme cases. This is generally referred as the medium run case, where the economy is operating below full employment but close to full employment level of output. The aggregate supply curve is upward sloping, representing a positive relationship between price level and output. It is neither horizontal nor vertical. This situation arises due to the wage price stickiness rather than rigidity or flexibility. Due to a change in the price level, due to a change in demand, wages and prices will adjust slowly to their new equilibrium levels. This is because of three reasons: sticky wage theory, sticky prices theory, and misperception theory. Moving on to the sticky wage theory, suppose demand increases, which results in a rise in the price level at the current output level. It is difficult for the firms to increase its supply by increasing its use of factors of production in the short run. Generally, firms operate with some fixed factors of production, usually capital, whose quantity is difficult to change in the short run. Even for the variable factors of production like labor, it is not possible for the firms to increase their labor use or to pay higher wages to their labor. For instance, if workers are hired on multi-year labor contracts with the firms, it is difficult for the firm to change the contract or to cancel the contract before the maturity period, and hence firms cannot increase the wages. Wages are sticky. In the medium run, some of the contracts attain their maturity and are subject to change, while workers also demand higher nominal wages in response to their lower real wages. As a result, wages start adjusting to the change in the price level. But this happens only slowly over a period of time. Moving on to the sticky price theory. When the price level increases, it is difficult for the firms to change the prices it charges in response to the changes in the general price level. For instance, consider a firm which prints its price catalogue. When price level gets changed, it is costly for the firm to change the price catalogues. If the cost for changing the prices charged in response to a change in the general price level, called the menu cost, is more than the cost of raising the production and hence supply of goods, firms would prefer to continue to operate with the old prices rather than with the new changed price level. Thus, prices are sticky. It will only be after a period of time when the firms realize that it should charge a higher price in response to the rise in the general price level, prices will start adjusting. Next, we will discuss the misperception theory. In the labor market, when nominal wages go up in response to a rise in the price level, workers have a misperception that it is a rise in their real wages. As a result, they supply more labor, leading to higher level of employment at output. They continue to do so until they realize that the rise in the wages is merely a rise in the nominal wages in response to the higher price level and not a rise in the real wages. Thus, output will rise and wages will adjust slowly to the changes in the price level.
Figure shows the medium run aggregate supply curve. Due to this sluggish adjustment of wages and prices, output will rise slowly, leading to the upward sloping aggregate supply curve. Output and price level is determined by the intersection of aggregate demand and supply curves. Equilibrium level of output is Y0 and the price level is P0. Let us discuss synthesis of short-run aggregate supply curve, long-run aggregate supply curve, and medium-run aggregate supply curve. The three cases for aggregate supply curves are synthesized into one single diagram. AS curve is horizontal in the short run, where wages and prices are rigid. When prices and wages start adjusting, aggregate supply curve becomes upward sloping, and it leads to a change in both real output and real wages and nominal variables, price level and nominal wage rate. This change in output continues until the economy reaches at full employment level of Y star, where the aggregate supply curve becomes vertical. Now, we will discuss the intersection of aggregate demand and aggregate supply curves representing equilibrium in three different scenarios. Output and price level in the economy will be determined by the intersection of aggregate demand and aggregate supply curves. The position of aggregate demand curve will determine whether the economy is operating at the full employment level, below full employment or near full employment level. In figure, three equilibria are presented, representing the three situations. If the aggregate demand curve is represented by AD1, the economy is operating below full employment level and wages and prices are rigid. If the aggregate demand is represented by AD2, the economy is in transition phase from short run to long run. Output and price level are determined by both aggregate supply and aggregate demand curves. If the aggregate demand curve is AD3, economy is operating at the full employment level and nominal wages and prices are flexible to keep output full employment level of Y star. Next, we will discuss the mathematical derivation of aggregate supply curve. Aggregate supply curve links the aggregate output supplied with the price level in the economy. Output supplied is affected by the labor employed in the production process, which in turn is dependent on the wage rates. Thus, derivation of aggregate supply curve requires linking the labor market with the goods market. This is done using the three equations. Production function links the factor of production to the level of output. Assuming that labor is the only factor of production, the simplest production function is the one in which output is proportional to labor input given by Y is equals to A into N, where Y is the aggregate output, N is the units of labor employed, and A is the labor productivity or the amount of output produced by per unit of labor input. Moving on to linking cost and prices, firms charge a price for their output which is a markup over their cost of production. Since we have assumed that there is only labor input, so prices are a markup over the wage cost. Given the previous equation, if only one unit of labor is employed in the production process, output is A units. In other words, N is equals to 1 is equals to and greater than Y is equals to A. If wage rate in the economy is given by W, then by incurring W cost, a firm produces A units of output. Thus, cost incurred in producing 1 unit of output is W by A. Since prices are markup over the cost, assume that the markup is given by Z, so prices are given by the following equation. P is equals to W by A plus Z into W by A. Or, in other words, P is equals to 1 plus Z into W by A. Now we will discuss the Phillips curve. The Phillips curve is an inverse relationship between the rate of unemployment and the rate of increase in the money wages. The higher the rate of unemployment, the lower is the rate of wage inflation. In other words, there is a trade-off between wage inflation and unemployment. Thus, the equation of Phillips curve is given by W is equals to W minus 1 into 1 plus epsilon into N minus N star divided by N star, where W is the current period wage rate, W minus 1 is the previous period wage rate, N is the actual level of employment in the economy, N star is the full employment level of economy, epsilon is the degree of responsiveness of wages to employment changes. The equation signifies that when actual level of employment in the economy is less than full employment level, wages will reduce compared to the previous period wage rate. Solving previous equations, we get P is equals to 1 plus z divided by a into w minus 1 into 1 plus epsilon into n minus n star divided by n star. Substitute n is equals to y by a and w minus 1 is equals to a into p minus 1 divided by 1 plus z and get p is equals to p minus 1 into 1 plus epsilon into y minus y star by y star. This is the equation of AS curve. Now we will discuss the slope of aggregate supply curve. As given in the previous equation, the slope of aggregate supply curve is given by the coefficient epsilon, the degree to which output or employment respond to the changes in the price level or the wage rates. Smaller epsilon means that for a given change in the aggregate output or employment, there are small changes in the price level or wage rates. This makes aggregate supply curve flatter. Consider the figure. AS2 is flatter than AS1. For the same change in the output level from Y1 to Y2, there are smaller changes in the price level along AS2 curve than along AS1 curve. Note that P2 minus P1 is less than P2 dash minus P1 dash. The position of AS curve is determined by the prices in the last period or P minus 1. Aggregate supply curve passes through the full employment level of output Y star when P is equals to P minus 1. If output is greater than the full employment level, prices rise next period, leading to an upward shift in aggregate supply curve at Y star. If output is below full employment level, then prices fall next period, leading to a downward shift in aggregate supply curve at Y star. See the figure. If output is greater than Y star, prices rise to P1 next period, shifting AS curve to AS1. If output is lower than Y star, prices fall next period, shifting AS curve to AS2.
A shock to the economy that changes the cost of production is called a supply shock. It has a direct bearing on the prices a firm charges for its goods and services, and hence supply shocks are sometimes referred to as price shocks. Examples of supply shocks are labor union asking for higher wages and going on for strike, and firms have to raise the wages which are passed on to the consumers in terms of higher prices, flood or drought destroying crops, increasing the food prices, or new environmental law requiring firms to produce their emission levels below a certain threshold, which is very costly. Such supply shocks reduce the supply of goods and services in the economy, shifting the aggregate supply curve upward.
Assuming that the full employment level of output remains unchanged with these supply shocks, the new aggregate supply curve will look like the one shown in the figure. In the short run and in the medium run, supply curve will shift upward to SRAS1 and MRAS1 respectively, while the long run AS curve remains unchanged. Finally, we will discuss the neutrality of money. Given that in the long run, economy attains full employment level of output, an increase in the money stock has no effect on output or real income and spending. Money is said to be neutral to the real variables, only changing the nominal variables. Consider the figure. Suppose the economy is operating at full employment level of output at Y star. An increase in the money stock shifts the aggregate demand curve rightwards proportionately. The new equilibrium should be at point E1, where output will be Y1, which is greater than Y star. Since output is above full employment level, price level will rise, raising the wage rates. In the short run and the medium run, due to workers' misperception and wage price stickiness, economy will operate above Y star. However, in the long run, prices and wages will adjust. As a result, aggregate supply curve will shift leftwards. The economy will again reach its full employment level at Y star.
Let us now summarize what we have learnt in this module. Aggregate supply curve gives the relationship between output supplied and the price level in the economy. In the short run, due to wage price rigidity, aggregate supply curve is horizontal and output is demand determined, which is in the Keynesian case. In the long run, due to the price wage flexibility, aggregate supply curve is vertical. Price level is demand determined, that is the case of the classical case. Money is neutral in the classical case. However, in the medium run, due to the sluggish adjustments in the wages and the prices, aggregate supply curve is upward sloping. Aggregate supply curve in this period may shift due to the changes in the last period prices, which could happen due to the supply shocks.